Three 12-year-old Girl Scouts vanished without a trace during a routine camping trip in Oregon's mountains, leaving behind their intact campsite and a 40-year mystery that would tear families apart. When a devastating storm finally exposed their secret, the truth about their final months of survival would prove more heartbreaking than anyone had dared imagine. Amy Chen carefully folded her merit badge sash and placed it in her backpack, running her fingers over the colorful patches she had earned over the past 3 years. At 12 years old, she had more badges than any other scout in Troop 47, but there was one that had eluded her, the Advanced Outdoors badge. This weekend's camping trip to Oregon's Cascade Mountains would finally give her the chance to earn it. The October morning air felt crisp as Amy walked into the community center, where scouts from 3 different troops were gathering for the special weekend expedition. This wasn't just any camping trip. Only the most experienced scouts had been invited to attempt the challenging requirements for the Advanced Outdoors badge, which included wilderness navigation, emergency shelter building, and surviving 2 nights in backcountry conditions. "Amy, over here," called Mrs. Patricia Donnelly, the expedition leader who had organized this ambitious weekend. Mrs. Donnelly had been leading scout trips for over 15 years and knew the Cascade Mountains better than most park rangers. Her reputation for safety and outdoor expertise made parents comfortable sending their daughters on more challenging adventures. Amy joined 2 other girls she had met at previous regional scout events. Linda Rodriguez, 11 years old from Troop 92, was already examining a field guide to Pacific Northwest plant life. Linda had earned her naturalist badge the previous summer and could identify more trees and wildlife than some college students. Her quiet intensity and genuine love for the outdoors made her the perfect companion for a wilderness expedition. "I brought extra batteries for my flashlight," announced Katie Morrison, the youngest member of their group at 10 years old. Katie had only joined the Scouts 6 months earlier, when her family moved to Oregon after her parents' divorce. Despite being the newcomer, she had impressed everyone with her determination and fearless attitude toward new challenges. Mrs. Donnelly gathered the 3 girls around a large topographical map spread across a folding table. "Ladies, this weekend you'll be camping at Bear Creek, about 15 miles into the Willamette National Forest. The weather forecast shows temperatures dropping into the 30s at night, so we'll need to be prepared for early winter conditions." Amy studied the map carefully, noting the elevation changes and marked trails. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had been preparing for. Linda pointed to various landmarks, sharing her knowledge about the local ecosystem. Katie asked practical questions about water sources and emergency procedures. "Remember, this badge requires each of you to demonstrate real wilderness skills," Mrs. Donnelly explained. "You'll need to work together, but you'll also be tested individually on navigation, campcraft, and emergency preparedness." As the girls loaded their gear into Mrs. Donnelly's station wagon, along with parent volunteers Mrs. Martinez and Mr. Thompson, Amy felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This weekend would prove whether she truly belonged among the elite scouts who had earned the Advanced Outdoors badge. The drive toward the mountains began with the girls sharing stories about their previous camping experiences, none of them knowing that this October weekend in 1974 would become the beginning of a mystery that would haunt their families for 40 years. Margaret Chen stared at the permission slip spread across her kitchen table, her pen hovering uncertainly over the signature line. The October evening light filtered through her window as she read the camping trip details for the 3rd time. 3 days in the Cascade Mountains, overnight temperatures potentially dropping below freezing, and her 12-year-old daughter Amy would be 15 miles from the nearest road. "Mom, you have to sign it," Amy pleaded from across the table, her dark eyes filled with determination. "This is my only chance to get the Advanced Outdoors badge before I age out of the program next year." Margaret understood her daughter's drive. Amy had always been the type of child who needed to excel at everything, whether it was academics, piano lessons, or Girl Scouts. But this relentless pursuit of achievement worried Margaret. Amy pushed herself harder than any 12-year-old should, and Margaret feared what might happen if her daughter encountered a situation where determination alone wasn't enough. "The weather forecast shows possible snow," Margaret said softly. "Maybe you could try for this badge next spring when conditions are safer." Amy's face fell. "Mrs. Donnelly says this might be the last Advanced Outdoors trip she organizes. She's thinking about retiring from scout leadership." After another moment of hesitation, Margaret signed the form. She couldn't bear to disappoint Amy, but a nagging worry settled in her chest as she watched her daughter's face light up with excitement. Across town, the Rodriguez family gathered around their dinner table as Maria Rodriguez explained the camping trip to her husband, Carlos. Linda sat quietly beside them, methodically eating her rice and beans while listening to her parents discuss whether she should participate. "This could be good for Linda," Maria said in Spanish. then switched to English for their daughter's benefit. She spends too much time alone with her books and nature collections. Maybe camping with other girls will help her make friends. Carlos nodded thoughtfully. Linda had always been painfully shy, preferring the company of plants and animals to other children. At 11 years old, she could identify every bird species in Oregon but struggled to start conversations with classmates. The camping trip might force her out of her shell. "I want to go," Linda said quietly, surprising both parents with her rare display of assertiveness. "I can teach the other girls about forest ecology." Maria smiled and signed the permission form, hoping this adventure would give Linda the confidence she needed to connect with peers who shared her interests. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Janet Morrison sat alone at her kitchen counter, wrestling with her own doubts. The divorce had been finalized only 6 months ago, and moving to Oregon had been supposed to give her and 10-year-old Katie a fresh start. But everything felt uncertain now. Katie bounced excitedly around the kitchen, chattering about sleeping bags and hiking boots. For the first time since the move, Janet saw genuine happiness in her daughter's eyes. Katie had struggled to make friends at her new school, and this camping trip represented her first real opportunity to bond with local children. "Please, Mom," Katie begged. "I promise I'll be careful and follow all the rules." Janet signed the form, believing that Katie deserved this chance at normalcy after months of upheaval and adjustment. The station wagon's engine hummed steadily as Mrs. Patricia Donnelly navigated the winding mountain road deeper into the Willamette National Forest. In the back seat, Amy Chen pressed her face against the window, watching the towering Douglas firs grow thicker as they climbed in elevation. Beside her, Linda Rodriguez quietly sketched the changing vegetation in her nature journal, while Katie Morrison peppered the adults with questions about everything from bear safety to water purification. "Look how the trees are already changing," Linda observed, pointing to patches of golden aspens scattered among the evergreens. "The elevation here must be close to 4,000 feet. Mrs. Donnelly glanced in the rearview mirror and smiled. After 15 years of leading scout expeditions, she still felt energized by the girls' enthusiasm for the outdoors. This particular group impressed her with their preparation and genuine interest in wilderness skills. Amy's leadership qualities, Linda's natural knowledge, and Katie's fearless curiosity made them ideal candidates for the challenging Advanced Outdoors badge. "Mrs. Donnelly, is that snow on those peaks?" Katie asked, pointing toward the higher ridges visible through the trees. "Just a dusting from last week's storm," replied Mr. Thompson, one of the parent volunteers who sat in the passenger seat. "The weather service says we should stay dry this weekend, though temperatures will definitely drop after sunset." Mrs. Martinez, the other parent volunteer, turned from the front seat to address the girls. "I packed extra blankets just in case. October weather in the mountains can be unpredictable." As they drove deeper into the forest, the temperature gauge on the dashboard dropped steadily. What had been a comfortable 55 degrees when they left the community center that Friday morning was now hovering near 40 degrees, and they still had several hours of daylight remaining. Amy pulled her jacket tighter as she noticed her breath starting to fog slightly when she spoke. "This is perfect weather for testing our cold weather camping skills," she announced, with characteristic optimism. The final stretch to Bear Creek Campground took them down a narrow dirt road that wound through increasingly dense forest. Massive cedar and fir trees blocked most of the afternoon sunlight, creating an almost twilight atmosphere even though it was barely 3 o'clock. "Here we are," Mrs. Donnelly announced as she pulled into a small clearing beside Bear Creek. The campground was primitive, with no facilities except a fire ring and a basic latrine. A wooden sign marked the spot, but otherwise they felt completely isolated from civilization. The girls tumbled out of the car, their excitement undimmed by the dropping temperature. Steam rose from the creek, indicating how much colder the mountain air had become compared to the relatively warm water flowing down from higher elevations. "First priority is setting up camp before we lose daylight," Mrs. Donnelly instructed. "Remember, this is your chance to demonstrate the skills you've learned. Work together, but each of you needs to show you can handle basic camping tasks independently." As the girls unpacked their gear and began selecting tent sites, none of them noticed the gray clouds gathering over the distant peaks, or how quickly the temperature continued to fall as the October afternoon progressed into what would become an unexpectedly harsh mountain evening. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Mrs. Patricia Donnelly adjusted the antenna on her portable radio as the sun began its descent behind the towering peaks surrounding Bear Creek Campground. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since their arrival, and her breath formed small clouds in the crisp mountain air. Behind her, the 3 girls worked diligently to complete their camp setup before darkness fell. Willamette Ranger Station, This is Patricia Donnelly with Girl Scout Expedition Group 7 Alpha. She spoke clearly into the radio handset. The static crackled for a moment before Ranger Jackson's familiar voice responded from the base station 15 miles away. Good evening, Patricia. How are things going up at Bear Creek? Mrs. Donnelly glanced back at the campsite where Amy Chen was demonstrating proper knot-tying techniques to Katie Morrison, while Linda Rodriguez gathered kindling for their evening fire. Despite the unexpected cold snap, all three girls remained enthusiastic and focused on their badge requirements. All personnel safe and accounted for, Mrs. Donnelly reported. We have 3 scouts and 3 adults at Bear Creek. Weather is colder than anticipated, but spirits are high. Temperature reading 38 degrees at 1700 hours. Through the radio speaker, she could hear papers rustling as Ranger Jackson made notes in the expedition log. Copy that, Patricia. Weather Service updated their forecast about an hour ago. You might see temperatures drop into the 20s overnight. Are you prepared for those conditions? Mrs. Donnelly looked toward their supply pile where they had extra sleeping bags and emergency gear. After 15 years of leading wilderness expeditions, she never took chances with safety equipment. Affirmative. We brought cold weather gear rated for sub-freezing temperatures. All scouts have appropriate clothing and sleeping systems. Excellent. What's your planned departure time for Sunday? We'll break camp after breakfast and expect to reach the trailhead by 1400 hours Sunday afternoon, Mrs. Donnelly replied, consulting the itinerary she kept clipped to her jacket pocket. I'll radio again when we reach the vehicles. Amy approached the radio setup, her cheeks red from the cold but her eyes bright with excitement. Mrs. Donnelly, we got our tents set up perfectly. Linda found the best spots that are sheltered from wind but close to the water source. Mrs. Donnelly smiled and held up one finger, indicating she needed to finish the radio communication. Ranger Jackson, the girls are demonstrating excellent outdoor skills. This group is well prepared for the Advanced Outdoors badge requirements. That's great to hear, Patricia. You folks stay warm up there. Check in tomorrow evening or sooner if you need anything. Will do. Girl Scout Expedition 7 Alpha, out. Mrs. Donnelly switched off the radio and began packing it back into its waterproof case. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the forest canopy as smoke from their campfire began rising into the darkening sky. October 14th, 1974 was ending peacefully, with 3 determined girls preparing to spend their first night in the wilderness. None of them could have imagined that Mrs. Donnelly's confident voice reporting their safety would be the last communication anyone would ever receive from Bear Creek Campground, or that Ranger Jackson's logbook entry would become crucial evidence in a mystery that would baffle investigators for the next 40 years. Margaret Chen checked her watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes as she paced the parking lot outside the Willamette National Forest Ranger Station. 6:30 on Sunday evening, and there was still no sign of Mrs. Donnelly's station wagon. Amy had promised to call the moment they returned to civilization, but Margaret's phone remained silent. They're probably just running late, said Carlos Rodriguez, though his voice carried more worry than conviction. He stood beside his wife Maria, both of them scanning the access road that led back from the mountains. Their daughter Linda was never late for anything, and the scheduled return time had been 2 o'clock that afternoon. Janet Morrison clutched her car keys tightly, her knuckles white with tension. Katie said they'd be back by dinner time. She was so excited about telling me everything they learned. The recently divorced mother had been looking forward to hearing about her daughter's first real adventure since their move to Oregon. Inside the ranger station, Ranger Jackson consulted his radio log and tried to remain calm for the worried parents gathering in his office. Mrs. Donnelly's last check-in was Friday evening. She reported everything normal and confirmed their Sunday departure plan. Vehicle breakdowns happen, especially on those mountain roads. But wouldn't they have radioed for help? Margaret asked, her nursing background making her think through emergency scenarios. Mrs. Donnelly seemed so prepared and professional. Ranger Jackson nodded, though privately he was beginning to share their concern. Patricia Donnelly had been leading wilderness expeditions for years without incident. She was meticulous about safety protocols and communication schedules. Missing a check-in was completely out of character. I'm sending a patrol up to Bear Creek to check on them, he announced, reaching for his radio. Probably just a simple explanation, but better safe than sorry. The parents settled into an uncomfortable wait as Rangers Williams and Thompson drove toward the mountains in a 4-wheel drive truck equipped with emergency medical supplies and communication equipment. The sun was setting behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the forest as the search team navigated the winding dirt road to Bear Creek Campground. At 8:15, Ranger Williams's voice crackled through the radio with a report that chilled everyone in the station. Base, we've located the campsite at Bear Creek. All 3 tents are still standing. Sleeping bags and personal gear appear untouched. Campfire is cold. Looks like it's been out for days. No sign of the 5 missing persons. The parents exchanged horrified glances as Ranger Jackson pressed the radio handset. Any signs of struggle or disturbance? Negative. Everything looks normal except nobody's here. Food supplies are still hanging in the bear cache. Mrs. Donnelly's radio is in her tent, turned off. It's like they just walked away from camp and never came back. Margaret Chen felt her legs go weak as the reality hit her. This wasn't a simple vehicle breakdown or communication failure. Amy, Linda, Katie, and their adult supervisors had vanished from their campsite without explanation, leaving behind all their essential survival gear in the growing darkness of the Cascade Mountains. By dawn on Monday morning, Bear Creek Campground had transformed into a command center buzzing with search and rescue activity. Sheriff's deputies, Forest Service rangers, and volunteer teams from 3 counties converged on the remote location where 5 people had mysteriously disappeared from their intact campsite. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived at 6:30, her breath visible in the frigid mountain air as she surveyed the scene. The temperature had dropped to 24 degrees overnight, and a light dusting of snow covered the abandoned tents and equipment. Whatever had happened to Mrs. Donnelly's group, they were now facing life-threatening conditions if they were still alive somewhere in the wilderness. "Bloodhounds are our best shot at finding a trail," announced Search and Rescue Coordinator Tom Bradley as he directed teams around a large topographical map spread across the hood of his truck. The scent should still be detectable despite the cold weather. Handler Jim Collins arrived with 2 German shepherds trained in wilderness tracking. The dogs immediately showed interest in the campsite perimeter, circling excitedly around the area where the missing group's sleeping bags had been found. Within minutes, both animals picked up a scent trail leading away from Bear Creek toward the steep terrain that rose dramatically to the east. "They're heading uphill," Collins reported as the dogs pulled eagerly toward a faint game trail barely visible among the dense underbrush. Whatever made them leave camp, they went this direction. The bloodhounds led searchers up increasingly treacherous slopes covered with loose rock and fallen timber. After climbing for nearly an hour, the trail became more difficult to follow as the dogs showed confusion, circling and whining at a rocky outcrop overlooking a deep ravine. "Scent's getting mixed up here," Collins explained to Detective Mitchell, who had followed the tracking team despite the challenging terrain. "Could be the wind patterns in this canyon, or maybe they changed direction." Above them, the sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the canyon walls as pilot Mark Stevens attempted to survey the area from the air. But the early October snowfall that had begun during the night was intensifying, creating dangerous flying conditions in the mountain passes. "Visibility is dropping fast up here," Stevens radioed to the command post. "Snow's getting heavier and wind gusts are picking up. I'm going to have to return to base before conditions get worse." By noon, search teams had covered over 8 square miles of rugged terrain without finding any trace of the missing group beyond the initial scent trail that had mysteriously vanished at the rocky outcrop. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with snow accumulating at 1 inch per hour and temperatures remaining well below freezing. Volunteer teams from local hiking clubs and church groups arrived throughout the day, swelling the search effort to over 60 people. But as afternoon turned to evening, the brutal reality became clear. 5 people had been missing for over 48 hours in conditions that survival experts described as potentially fatal for anyone unprepared for extreme cold. Detective Mitchell watched fresh snow cover the search team's footprints and realized they were running out of time to find Mrs. Donnelly's group alive. Detective Sarah Mitchell spread Mrs. Patricia Donnelly's personnel file across her desk as the search entered its second week. What she discovered painted a troubling picture that complicated the missing persons investigation. The experienced scout leader who had seemed so reliable and professional was hiding serious personal problems that might explain the mysterious disappearance. "Look at this," Mitchell said to Sheriff Davis, pointing to a stack of unpaid bills found in Mrs. Donnelly's apartment. She was 3 months behind on rent, her car payment, credit cards maxed out, and there's something else. The detective pulled out a medical prescription bottle dated just 2 weeks before the camping trip. Mrs. Donnelly had been prescribed antidepressants following what her doctor described as a severe emotional crisis related to her recent divorce and custody battle. "Her ex-husband claims she'd been acting erratically," Mitchell continued, talking about starting over somewhere new, making comments about taking the girls on adventures they'd never forget. He thought she was just being dramatic about the divorce. Meanwhile, witness reports were creating chaos for the investigation. A gas station attendant in Northern California insisted he'd seen Mrs. Donnelly's station wagon with several children inside on Tuesday morning. A motel clerk in Washington state claimed a woman matching Mrs. Donnelly's description had checked in with 3 young girls but paid cash and used a false name. Margaret Chen received dozens of phone calls from well-meaning strangers reporting possible sightings. "Someone saw Amy at a McDonald's in Portland," she told the other parents during one of their daily meetings at the ranger station. Another person thinks they spotted the whole group at a campground near the coast. Each lead required investigation, sending search teams racing across 3 states, only to discover cases of mistaken identity. The McDonald's sighting turned out to be a different Asian girl with her family. The coastal campground report involved a church group that looked nothing like the missing scouts when investigators actually interviewed witnesses. The most disturbing development came from Forest Service rangers, who discovered evidence of recent human activity at several remote campsites throughout the Cascade Mountains. Abandoned food containers, makeshift shelters, and campfire remains suggested that drifters or transients had been moving through the area during October. "We found 3 different camps that show signs of multiple occupants," Ranger Jackson reported to Detective Mitchell. "Could be harmless hikers, but we also know there are people living off the grid in these mountains who don't want to be found." One particular site, located 12 miles from Bear Creek, contained items that didn't match typical camping gear. Children's clothing fragments, a hair ribbon, and what appeared to be Girl Scout handbook pages scattered around a hastily abandoned fire pit. This could be where they were taken, Mitchell theorized, though she couldn't explain how the group had traveled such a distance through difficult terrain without leaving a clear trail. As October ended and November brought harsher weather, the official search was scaled back to weekend volunteer efforts. The false leads continued, keeping hope alive for desperate families, while investigators struggled to separate genuine clues from the dozens of mistaken sightings that plagued every high-profile missing persons case. Detective Sarah Mitchell stared at the whiteboard in the Willamette County Sheriff's conference room, where 3 distinct theories about the missing Girl Scouts had taken shape after weeks of investigation. Each explanation seemed plausible until examined closely, leaving investigators frustrated and families desperate for answers. Theory 1, voluntary disappearance, Mitchell announced to the assembled task force. Mrs. Donnelly was facing financial ruin, severe depression, and a bitter custody battle. Her ex-husband reported strange comments about starting fresh and taking the girls on unforgettable adventures. Sheriff Davis nodded grimly. The timing supports this. She knew about her mounting debts, the pending eviction notice. Maybe she snapped and decided to disappear with the girls, thinking she was protecting them somehow. Evidence supporting this theory included Mrs. Donnelly's recent cash withdrawals totaling $800, her purchase of extra camping supplies beyond what the trip required, and witness reports of possible sightings in California and Washington. Her personal problems provided clear motivation for someone desperate enough to abandon her old life. But Detective Mitchell had serious doubts. How does a depressed woman in financial crisis convince 3 smart girls to abandon their families? Amy Chen was a natural leader who would have questioned any deviation from the planned itinerary. And why leave behind essential survival gear if you're planning to disappear permanently? Ranger Thompson presented the second theory during the next briefing. Abduction by transients. We've documented at least 6 different camps used by drifters in the past month. Some of these people are avoiding law enforcement for serious reasons. The discovery of children's clothing at an abandoned campsite 12 miles from Bear Creek strengthened this possibility. Local residents reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles and suspicious individuals in the area during October. One particularly disturbing lead involved a convicted child predator who had been released from prison 3 months before the disappearance. "These mountains attract people who don't want to be found," Thompson explained. "Survivalists, criminals fleeing justice, mentally unstable individuals living completely off the grid. Any of them could have encountered the girls during a hiking expedition." However, this theory also had weaknesses. The bloodhounds had tracked scents leading away from camp voluntarily, not showing signs of struggle or forced movement. No demands for ransom had been received, and extensive searches of known transient camps had produced no concrete evidence of the missing group. Dr. Patricia Williams, a wilderness survival expert, presented the third possibility: tragic accident followed by exposure deaths. October weather in the Cascades can turn deadly without warning. If they became lost or injured away from their base camp, survival time would be measured in hours, not days. This theory explained why searchers found no trail beyond the rocky outcrop where the bloodhounds lost the scent. A fall into the deep ravines could have killed or incapacitated the entire group, while heavy snowfall would have quickly concealed bodies and evidence. As November turned to December, each theory gained and lost support as new evidence emerged. Mrs. Donnelly's personal crisis suggested voluntary disappearance. The transient activity indicated possible abduction. The brutal weather conditions made accidental death increasingly likely. Investigators found themselves chasing leads that seemed to support all 3 possibilities while proving none of them conclusively. The Christmas tree in Margaret Chen's living room stood half-decorated, its bare branches reflecting the emptiness that had consumed her home since Amy's disappearance. Boxes of ornaments sat unopened on the coffee table, including the handmade angel Amy had crafted in second grade. Margaret couldn't bring herself to hang it, but she also couldn't bear to put it away. "We should finish decorating," her husband David suggested gently on December 23rd. "Amy would want us to celebrate Christmas." Margaret shook her head, tears flowing freely. "How can we celebrate anything when we don't know if she's cold, hungry, or even alive? What kind of mother puts up Christmas lights while her daughter might be suffering somewhere?" Across town, the Rodriguez household faced even greater challenges as 1974 drew to a close. Carlos Rodriguez had suffered a massive heart attack 3 weeks after Linda's disappearance, brought on by the crushing stress and sleepless nights spent coordinating search efforts. Medical bills were piling up alongside the emotional devastation. "The insurance won't cover all of it," Maria whispered to her sister during a hushed phone conversation while Carlos slept in their bedroom. "We might lose the house. I had to take a second job at the grocery store just to pay for his medications." Linda's younger brother, Miguel, only 8 years old, wandered through their home asking when his sister would come back to help him with his nature collection. Maria had no answers for him, just like she had no answers for the stack of medical bills that seemed to grow larger each day. The Chen and Rodriguez families found unexpected comfort in Janet Morrison, who had organized weekly support group meetings in the community center basement. Every Thursday evening, the three mothers gathered with other parents who had experienced similar tragedies, sharing their grief and trying to maintain hope. "I keep thinking this is my fault," Janet confessed during one December meeting, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should never have signed that permission slip. Katie was only 10 years old. What was I thinking, letting her go into the wilderness?" The other mothers tried to console her, but Janet's guilt ran deeper than rational thought. She had moved to Oregon seeking a fresh start after her divorce, and now her decision to let Katie join the camping trip felt like the worst mistake of her life. "The counselor says survivor's guilt is normal," Margaret offered, though she struggled with her own version of the same feelings. "We all thought we were giving our daughters wonderful opportunities." As New Year's Eve approached, the three families made different choices about how to mark the transition. The Chens spent the evening at church, praying for Amy's safe return. The Rodriguez family stayed home, focused on Carlos's recovery and trying to shield Miguel from their financial worries. Janet Morrison sat alone in her apartment, staring at Katie's empty bedroom and wondering if 1975 would bring answers or just more heartbreak. The first winter without their daughters tested each family's strength in ways they never could have imagined when they signed those permission slips back in October. Detective Sarah Mitchell inherited the Girl Scout cold case file in March of 1976, 18 months after the disappearance that had baffled her predecessors. The cardboard boxes stacked in her office contained hundreds of witness statements, search reports, and evidence logs that previous investigators had compiled during the intensive initial investigation. Mitchell approached the case with fresh perspective, methodically reviewing every piece of evidence without the emotional weight that had clouded earlier efforts. What she discovered in the files made her stomach turn. A crucial lead had been inadequately investigated during the chaotic early days of the search. "Look at this," she told Sheriff Davis, spreading surveillance photos across her desk. Robert Hensley, convicted child predator, released from Oregon State Penitentiary on July 15, 1974. His parole officer lost track of him 6 weeks before the girls disappeared. The photographs showed a thin man with shoulder-length brown hair and distinctive facial scars from a prison fight. More disturbing was his known pattern of targeting young girls in wilderness areas, using his knowledge of camping and hiking to gain victims' trust before attacking them. "Why wasn't this guy a priority from day one?" Mitchell demanded, though she already knew the answer. The original investigation had been overwhelmed by false sightings, and the theory that Mrs. Donnelly had orchestrated a voluntary disappearance. Further investigation revealed that Hensley had been spotted at a gas station just 20 miles from Bear Creek Campground on October 13th, the same day the Girl Scout group had arrived. The station attendant remembered him because he had asked detailed questions about camping areas and trail access roads. He was real interested in where families liked to camp, the attendant told Mitchell during a follow-up interview. Asked about places that were isolated but still accessible by car. Made me uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Armed with this new information, Mitchell organized searches of previously unexplored ravines and canyon systems within a 50-mile radius of Bear Creek. The original search teams had focused on areas where lost hikers might logically travel, not on remote locations where someone might hide victims. Search and rescue coordinator Tom Bradley assembled specialized teams equipped with rappelling gear to access steep canyon areas that had been deemed too dangerous during the initial investigation. "We're looking at places nobody would go voluntarily," he explained to the assembled volunteers. Deep ravines, unstable rock formations, areas where someone might dispose of evidence. The new searches revealed disturbing findings within days. In a narrow canyon 15 miles southeast of Bear Creek, searchers discovered makeshift camps that showed signs of recent human activity. Scattered among the debris were items that didn't belong in the wilderness. Candy wrappers from brands popular with children, pieces of rope that could have been used for restraints, and most chilling of all, fragments of what appeared to be Girl Scout badges. "This changes everything," Mitchell told the families during an emergency briefing. "We now have strong evidence suggesting that the girls encountered someone with criminal intent. We're treating this as an active kidnapping investigation with a known suspect." For the first time since the disappearance, investigators had a clear direction and a name: Robert Hensley. Tommy Chen turned 16 in 1979, 5 years after his sister Amy's disappearance, but he felt decades older than his classmates who worried about driver's licenses and prom dates. While other teenagers spent weekends at movies or football games, Tommy dedicated every spare moment to wilderness search and rescue training. "You need to have a normal teenage life," his mother Margaret pleaded as she watched him pack climbing gear and emergency medical supplies for another weekend training session. "Amy wouldn't want you to sacrifice your youth because of what happened to her." But Tommy couldn't stop. Learning wilderness survival skills felt like the only way to honor Amy's memory and possibly prevent other families from experiencing their tragedy. He had earned certifications in first aid, wilderness navigation, and technical rescue techniques that impressed even veteran search coordinators. "The kid knows these mountains better than rangers with 20 years' experience," search and rescue coordinator Bradley told Detective Mitchell. "He's found 3 lost hikers in the past year alone, but I worry he's pushing himself too hard, like he's trying to make up for not being able to save his sister." Across town, Linda Rodriguez's younger sister Elena struggled with the opposite reaction to their family's tragedy. At 14 years old, Elena had developed crippling anxiety about any outdoor activities, even refusing to walk to school if the route passed through the small park near their neighborhood. "She won't even go camping in our backyard," Maria Rodriguez confided to the family therapist during one of Elena's sessions. Last month, she had a panic attack when her biology class took a field trip to the nature center. "She keeps saying the forest is where bad things happen to little girls." Elena's fears weren't entirely irrational. The ongoing investigation into Robert Hensley had revealed that predators often targeted children in wilderness settings where screams couldn't be heard and bodies might never be found. This knowledge made Elena's anxiety seem like a reasonable response to an unreasonable world. Meanwhile, in the small apartment across town, 20-year-old Mark Morrison had abandoned his engineering studies at Oregon State University to care for his mother Janet, whose grief had consumed her ability to function normally. What began as a temporary leave of absence had stretched into 3 years of working construction jobs to pay rent and groceries. "Mom hasn't left the apartment in 6 months except for grocery shopping," Mark told his father during one of their rare phone conversations. "She sits by Katie's bedroom window every afternoon, watching for a little girl who's never coming home. The doctor says she's clinically depressed, but she won't take medication." Mark had sacrificed his own future to keep his family from completely falling apart, but the weight of responsibility was crushing him. His girlfriend had left, his college friends had moved on with their lives, and his dreams of becoming an engineer seemed impossibly distant. The 3 families had become experts in different forms of survival. Tommy channeled his grief into action, Elena retreated into protective isolation, and Mark shouldered burdens no 20-year-old should carry. Each coping strategy helped them endure, but none could fill the holes left by 3 missing girls. Robert Hensley lay dying in Oregon State Penitentiary's medical ward in February of 1983, serving a life sentence for crimes committed after the Girl Scout investigation had gone cold. The cancer consuming his lungs had given him perhaps weeks to live, and prison chaplain Father Martinez noticed the convicted predator seemed desperate to unburden himself of something. "I need to talk to that detective, the woman who was asking about those missing girls," Hensley wheezed during what would become their final conversation. "Mitchell, I think her name was. There's things I never told nobody about that camping trip." Detective Sarah Mitchell received the call at home on a Friday evening. 9 years had passed since she'd taken over the case, and Hensley's name still appeared on her active suspect list, despite the lack of concrete evidence linking him to the disappearance. "He's asking for you specifically," Father Martinez explained over the phone. "Says he wants to make things right before he meets his maker. Could be a dying man's attempt at redemption, or it could be the break you've been waiting for." Mitchell drove to the prison that weekend, carrying a tape recorder and the slim hope that Hensley might finally provide answers about Amy Chen, Linda Rodriguez, and Katie Morrison. What she heard in the sterile medical ward changed the entire direction of the investigation. "I was in those mountains when them girls went missing," Hensley admitted, his voice barely audible through the oxygen mask. "I seen their camp, watched them for a while. But I didn't take them, detective. Something else happened up there, something that scared me enough to get far away fast." Hensley claimed he had been living in a cave system about 3 miles from Bear Creek Campground, planning to approach the Girl Scout group when opportunity presented itself. But on the morning of October 15th, he witnessed something that made him abandon his plans entirely. Heard screaming coming from down in the deep canyon, south of where they was camped, not like somebody playing or horsing around. Real terror screaming, then nothing. I went to investigate and found blood on the rocks, but no bodies. The dying man provided specific coordinates and described landmarks that only someone familiar with the remote canyon system could know. More importantly, he led investigators to evidence that had been overlooked during previous searches. Armed with Hensley's confession and new forensic technology available in the 1980s, Mitchell organized the most comprehensive search effort since the original investigation. Ground-penetrating radar units scanned the rocky canyon floor where Hensley claimed to have heard the screaming. The radar detected several anomalies beneath tons of rock that had apparently shifted during the harsh winter following the disappearance. Excavation teams worked for weeks to clear debris from what appeared to be a natural rock slide area. Advanced forensic analysis of fabric fragments and bone samples found in the debris confirmed human remains, but decades of exposure and geological pressure had made positive identification impossible with existing technology. "We found them," Mitchell told the gathered families, though her voice carried more sorrow than triumph. "But we may never know exactly what happened in that canyon, or whether it was accident or something more sinister." Margaret Chen stood at the edge of Bear Creek on October 14, 2000, exactly 26 years after Amy's disappearance. The annual memorial hike had grown from a small family gathering into an event that drew hundreds of participants. But Margaret found herself feeling more isolated than ever among the well-meaning crowds. "Mom, you don't have to do this every year," her son Tommy said gently, his search and rescue uniform marking him as one of the volunteer coordinators for the event. At 36 years old, he had built his entire career around wilderness safety, but he worried that his mother's annual pilgrimage to Bear Creek was preventing her from finding peace. Margaret touched the memorial plaque that had been installed near the original campsite, reading the names etched in bronze: Amy Chen, Linda Rodriguez, Katie Morrison, Patricia Donnelly, and the parent volunteers whose names had become forever linked to the mystery. "As long as there's no real answer about what happened, I have to keep coming back." The memorial hikes had become a complex mixture of remembrance and ongoing investigation. Each year brought new volunteers who hoped fresh eyes might spot evidence that previous searchers had missed. Advanced hiking groups explored increasingly remote areas, while families shared updates about leads that inevitably led nowhere. Maria Rodriguez approached the memorial with her daughter Elena, now 36 and finally able to participate in outdoor activities after decades of therapy. The Rodriguez family had found a different kind of acceptance, focusing on honoring Linda's memory rather than continuing the search for answers. Linda would have loved seeing how many people care about protecting children in the wilderness. Maria told the assembled crowd during the memorial service, "The safety program started because of our girls have probably saved dozens of other families from going through what we experienced." The Girl Scout organization had indeed implemented comprehensive safety reforms following the tragedy. New requirements included mandatory GPS devices, satellite communication equipment, and backup emergency plans that previous generations of Scout leaders had never considered necessary. Janet Morrison's absence from the memorial was notable. After years of attending religiously, she had stopped coming in 1998, telling other families that she needed to accept Katie was gone and try to build some kind of normal life for herself. "Some people think we're living in the past," said Mark Morrison, who had taken over his mother's role at the annual events. "But these hikes serve a purpose beyond grief. They keep the case visible, remind law enforcement that people still care about finding answers." Detective Mitchell, now retired but still following the case as a private investigator, addressed the crowd each year with updates about new forensic techniques and ongoing efforts to identify the remains found in the 1980s. DNA technology was advancing rapidly, offering hope that conclusive identification might finally be possible. As the 2000s progressed, the memorial hikes became both a celebration of the girls' lives and a stubborn refusal to let their story fade into forgotten history. Some families found healing and acceptance, while others discovered purpose in the endless search for truth. The email arrived in Margaret Chen's inbox on a Tuesday morning in March of 2010, 36 years after Amy's disappearance. The sender identified himself as moderator of a website called Cold Case Northwest, and his message contained crime scene photographs and evidence analysis that Margaret hadn't seen since the original Investigation. We've digitized hundreds of missing person files from the 70s and 80s, wrote forum administrator David Walsh. Your daughter's case has generated significant interest from our community of amateur investigators. We believe fresh analytical approaches might reveal overlooked connections. Margaret clicked the attached link and found herself staring at a professionally designed website where dozens of strangers were discussing Amy, Linda, and Katie's disappearance with the intensity of trained detectives. Forum members had created detailed timelines, analyzed weather patterns, and even built three-dimensional computer models of the terrain around Bear Creek Campground. This is either amazing or deeply disturbing, Amy Chen told his mother as they scrolled through pages of speculation and evidence analysis. These people know more details about Amy's case than some of the original investigators. The internet had transformed cold case investigation in ways that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Amateur sleuths with backgrounds in forensics, geology, and criminal psychology collaborated across the country, sharing theories and conducting virtual evidence analysis that supplemented official investigations. Forum member Sarah Jenkins, a retired FBI analyst, had identified previously unexplored connections between the Girl Scout disappearance and 3 other missing person cases from the same time period. Her analysis suggested a possible pattern of abductions targeting families or groups in remote wilderness areas. The geographic clustering isn't random, Jenkins posted in a thread that had attracted over 2,000 comments. Someone familiar with these mountain systems was selecting victims based on accessibility and isolation factors that most predators wouldn't understand. Elena Rodriguez found the online attention more troubling than helpful. These people are treating Linda's death like a puzzle to solve for entertainment, she complained to her mother. They don't understand that every theory they post reopens wounds that took decades to heal. The digital revival reached its peak when documentary filmmaker Michael Chen, no relation to the family, arrived in Oregon with a production crew and ambitious plans for a feature-length film about the case. His timing coincided with advances in DNA technology that offered genuine hope for identifying the remains found in the 80s. We can tell this story in a way that honors the victims, while highlighting the incredible dedication of families who never gave up searching for answers, Chen explained to Margaret during their first meeting. Documentary films have solved cold cases before by reaching new audiences who might have crucial information. But the attention came at a cost. Reporters contacted family members seeking fresh interviews. True crime podcasters analyzed evidence on weekly shows. Social media posts shared crime scene photos without permission or context. Margaret found herself caught between hope that new technology might finally provide answers and exhaustion from decades of false promises and renewed publicity that made normal life impossible whenever the case gained attention. The Weather Service issued the first storm warnings on October 10, 2014, exactly 40 years and 4 days before the anniversary of Amy, Linda, and Katie's disappearance. Meteorologist Jennifer Walsh had never seen atmospheric conditions quite like the massive low-pressure system approaching the Pacific Northwest from the Gulf of Alaska. This storm system is unprecedented for our region, Walsh announced during the evening news broadcast. We're looking at sustained winds of 70 to 80 miles per hour with gusts exceeding 100 miles per hour. Rainfall totals could reach 15 inches in mountainous areas over the next 48 hours. The storm struck the Cascade Mountains with devastating force on October 13th, the exact date the Girl Scouts had arrived at Bear Creek Campground 4 decades earlier. Hurricane-force winds toppled thousand-year-old Douglas firs and stripped entire hillsides of vegetation that had been growing undisturbed since the last ice age. Amy Chen monitored the weather reports from his search and rescue command center in Portland, knowing that conditions in the mountains were far too dangerous for any rescue operations. I've never seen sustained winds this strong in the Cascades, he told his team as they tracked the storm's progress. This is going to reshape the entire landscape up there. The rainfall accompanying the windstorm exceeded all historical records for the region. Bear Creek, normally a gentle mountain stream, became a raging torrent that carved new channels through terrain that had remained stable for centuries. The creek's flow increased from its normal rate of 50 cubic feet per second to over 3,000 cubic feet per second at the peak of the storm. Forest Service rangers evacuated all personnel from wilderness areas as massive landslides began occurring throughout the mountain range. Entire mountainsides that had been stable since geological surveys began collapsed under the weight of saturated soil and the pressure of hurricane-force winds. We're seeing erosion patterns that normally take decades to develop happening in a matter of hours, explained Forest Service geologist Dr. Amanda Torres as she reviewed satellite imagery of the devastation. Creeks are cutting completely new channels, exposing rock formations and soil layers that haven't seen daylight in thousands of years. The storm's impact on the area around Bear Creek Campground was particularly severe. The campground itself, which had been maintained as an unofficial memorial site for 40 years, was completely destroyed by falling trees and flash flooding. The memorial plaque, honoring the missing Girl Scouts, was buried under tons of debris carried by the swollen creek. By October 15th, when the storm finally moved inland and began to weaken, the Cascade Mountains had been transformed beyond recognition. Satellite photographs showed a landscape stripped bare in many areas, with new geological features exposed where ancient forests had stood just days before. "It's like the mountains have been turned inside out," observed retired Detective Sarah Mitchell as she studied aerial photographs of the devastation. 40 years to the day after those girls disappeared, and nature decides to reveal secrets that have been hidden since the last ice age. None of them could have imagined that the storm's reshaping of the landscape would soon expose the truth about what had happened to 5 people who had vanished into the wilderness exactly 4 decades earlier. Mark Thompson had been hiking the Cascade Mountains for over 20 years, but the landscape he encountered on November 4, 2014, looked like an alien planet. 3 weeks after the devastating storm, he was among the first civilians allowed back into the wilderness areas that had been completely reshaped by hurricane-force winds and record rainfall. "I don't recognize anything up here," Thompson muttered to himself as he consulted his GPS unit, trying to navigate terrain that bore no resemblance to the topographical maps he had relied on for decades. Massive landslides had carved entirely new valleys while filling others with millions of tons of debris. Thompson was an experienced outdoorsman who had participated in search and rescue operations throughout the Pacific Northwest. He knew the story of the missing Girl Scouts and had even joined several memorial hikes over the years. But today, he was simply exploring the dramatic changes the storm had created in his favorite hiking area. His GPS showed he was approximately 2 miles southeast of where Bear Creek Campground had been located before the storm destroyed it completely. The creek itself now followed a completely different course, having carved a new channel through previously solid rock formations that had been exposed when ancient trees were uprooted. As Thompson picked his way carefully across unstable scree slopes created by recent landslides, something caught his eye near the base of a granite cliff face that had been revealed when tons of soil and vegetation were stripped away by the storm. Geometric shapes that definitely didn't belong in nature were visible among the rocks and debris. "What the hell?" Thompson said aloud, pulling out his binoculars for a closer look. Even from 50 yards away, he could see fabric remnants and what appeared to be metal objects partially buried in the landslide debris. Thompson activated the emergency beacon function on his GPS unit and began taking photographs with his digital camera as he approached the site. His search and rescue training had taught him to document everything before disturbing potential evidence, especially in remote areas where investigation teams might take days to arrive. The fabric appeared to be synthetic material that had been protected from decades of weather exposure, suggesting it had been buried until the recent storm. More disturbing were the metal objects, which looked like camping equipment but showed signs of age that indicated they had been in the wilderness for many years. Thompson's heart began racing as he realized the significance of what he was seeing. The coordinates on his GPS placed him in terrain that had never been searched during the original investigation because it had been completely inaccessible, blocked by dense forest and steep rock faces that no one could have climbed without specialized equipment. "This is Mark Thompson calling Forest Service Dispatch," he spoke into his satellite radio. "I'm at coordinates 44.78 north, 121.45 west. I've found what appears to be camping equipment that's been buried for decades. You need to send an investigation team up here immediately." The storm that had devastated the mountains exactly 40 years after the Girl Scout disappearance had finally revealed their secret. Sheriff's Deputy Lisa Chang rappelled down the granite cliff face on November 7, 2014, 3 days after Mark Thompson's discovery had triggered the largest recovery operation in Cascade Mountain's history. The coordinates he had provided led to a natural alcove that had been completely hidden from view until the recent storm stripped away 40 years of forest growth. "I can see structural elements down here," Chang radioed to the command post established on the ridge above. "Looks like someone built a shelter against the rock face. It's been protected from the elements by the overhang." The shelter that came into view as Chang descended was remarkable in its construction. Someone had used fallen logs, stacked stones, and salvaged materials to create a windproof enclosure that could have provided protection from even the harshest mountain weather. Pine boughs had been woven into the walls for insulation, and a sophisticated ventilation system prevented smoke buildup from a carefully constructed fire pit. "This wasn't thrown together in desperation," observed Forest Service engineer Tom Bradley as he joined the recovery team. "Whoever built this understood wilderness survival and had time to do it properly. This shelter could have kept people alive for months." Inside the shelter, the recovery team made discoveries that answered 40 years of questions while raising new ones. 5 sets of human remains were arranged along the back wall, covered with sleeping bags and camping equipment that matched the inventory from the original Girl Scout expedition. But it was the leather journal found beside the remains that provided the most shocking revelation. Mrs. Patricia Donnelly had documented their survival story in meticulous detail, creating a record that would finally explain what had happened to the missing group. October 16th, 1974. Chang read aloud from the first entry as investigators photographed each page. We left camp this morning to explore the waterfall Linda wanted to see. Simple day hike, we thought. The trail disappeared after half a mile and we got turned around. By afternoon, we were completely lost. The early entries described their growing desperation as they realized how far they had wandered from Bear Creek Campground. Mrs. Donnelly had made the decision to keep moving rather than stay put and wait for rescue, believing they could find their way back to a main trail. October 23rd, 1974. Found this alcove yesterday. Girls are scared but holding together. Amy is being so brave, helping with everything. Linda found edible plants, and Katie keeps everyone's spirits up. We can survive here until spring if we have to. The journal revealed that all 5 had lived for over 2 months in their hidden shelter, surviving on gathered food, small game, and emergency supplies they had managed to salvage. Mrs. Donnelly had documented their gradual weakening as winter deepened and food sources became scarce. The final entry, dated January 8, 1975, was written in barely legible handwriting. Katie passed during the night. Only Amy and I left now. So cold. I'm sorry I got us lost. Tell the families we tried. Margaret Chen sat in the Forest Service conference room on November 10, 2014, listening to Detective Rodriguez read excerpts from Mrs. Donnelly's journal that finally explained 40 years of agonizing questions. The truth was both simpler and more heartbreaking than any of the theories investigators had pursued over the decades. October 16, 1974, Rodriguez read from the water-stained pages. Linda begged to see Cascade Falls, about 3 miles east of our camp. I thought it would be good exercise and a chance for the girls to practice navigation skills. We left our heavy packs at Bear Creek, planning to be back by lunch. The journal revealed that Mrs. Donnelly had made a fatal error in judgment that morning. Instead of following the marked trail system, she had decided to take what appeared to be a shorter route through unmarked terrain. The group had become disoriented when the informal trail disappeared entirely, leaving them in dense forest with no clear way back to their campsite. October 17, 1974. We're completely lost. My compass readings don't match the topographical map. I think we went too far north when we tried to circle back yesterday. The girls are frightened but trusting me to get them home safely. I have to figure this out. Maria Rodriguez dabbed at her eyes as the detective continued reading. After 40 years of wondering whether Linda had suffered, whether she had been afraid, the journal provided definitive but painful answers. The girls had remained hopeful for weeks, believing Mrs. Donnelly would eventually lead them back to civilization. The journal documented their discovery of the hidden alcove on October 22nd, when dropping temperatures and the first heavy snowfall convinced Mrs. Donnelly they needed shelter more substantial than their lightweight camping gear could provide. The natural overhang had seemed like a temporary refuge that became their final home. November 15th, 1974. Amy organized a rationing system for our remaining food. Linda has been incredible at finding edible plants and identifying safe water sources. Katie keeps everyone laughing even though we're all scared. These girls are so much braver than I am. Detective Rodriguez paused as she reached entries describing the group's gradual weakening as winter deepened. Mrs. Donnelly had documented every detail of their survival efforts, from building the sophisticated shelter to their attempts to signal aircraft that occasionally flew overhead. December 23rd, 1974. Christmas tomorrow. The girls made decorations from pine needles and berries. Amy says we'll have the most memorable Christmas ever. She's right, but not in the way she meant. The final entries revealed how they had died one by one over the brutal winter months. Linda succumbed to pneumonia in early January. Katie died of exposure and malnutrition 2 weeks later. Amy and Mrs. Donnelly survived until late January before hypothermia claimed them both. No evidence of foul play, Detective Rodriguez concluded. No abduction, no criminal activity. Just a tragic series of decisions that led 5 people into terrain they couldn't escape from when weather conditions became unsurvivable. The 40-year mystery was solved, but the truth offered little comfort to families who had spent decades imagining far worse scenarios. The joint funeral service at Riverside Memorial Park on December 15, 2014, brought brought together hundreds of people who had followed the Girl Scout case for 4 decades. 3 small caskets sat beneath a canopy of Douglas fir branches, finally allowing Amy Chen, Linda Rodriguez, and Katie Morrison to come home to families who had never stopped waiting for them. Margaret Chen approached the podium with steady steps, her voice clear despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. At 78 years old, she had waited most of her adult life for this moment, though she had never imagined it would bring such complex emotions. 40 years ago, I was angry at Patricia Donnelly for taking my daughter into those mountains, Margaret began, addressing the crowd of family members, former investigators, and community supporters. I blamed her for making the decisions that led to this tragedy. But after reading her journal, after understanding what she went through trying to keep our girls alive, I need to say something. The audience listened in complete silence as Margaret continued. Patricia Donnelly died trying to protect our children. She made a mistake that cost 5 lives, but she spent her final months fighting to bring Amy, Linda, and Katie home safely. She didn't abandon them. She didn't give up. She loved them enough to die with them. Tommy Chen stood beside his mother, now 50 years old and wearing his search and rescue uniform as a tribute to the sister who had inspired his life's work. The boy who had spent decades searching the mountains for Amy was finally able to let her rest. Maria Rodriguez spoke next, her words mixing English and Spanish as she addressed both her American neighbors and the extended family members who had traveled from Mexico for the service. Linda always said the forest was where she felt closest to God. Now we know she spent her final months teaching others about the plants and animals she loved so much. She never lost her generous spirit, even at the end. The memorial ceremony included representatives from all 3 Girl Scout troops that had been involved in the original expedition. Current scouts, many of them the same age Amy, Linda, and Katie had been in 1974, placed wildflowers on each casket while reciting the Girl Scout promise. Janet Morrison's son Mark spoke for his mother, who had declined to attend the service. Katie would be 50 years old today if she had lived. Mom has spent 40 years imagining the woman Katie might have become. But we know from Mrs. Donnelly's journal that Katie never lost her optimism, never stopped believing they would find their way home. That's how we choose to remember her. The service concluded with the dedication of a new memorial at the entrance to the Willamette National Forest. Unlike the simple plaque that had marked their disappearance site, this monument included excerpts from Mrs. Donnelly's journal emphasizing the courage and hope the 5 had maintained during their final months together. As families placed roses on the fresh graves, the 40-year search for Amy, Linda, and Katie finally ended not with answers to every question, but with the peace that comes from bringing loved ones home. On October 14th, 2015, exactly 41 years after Amy Chen, Linda Rodriguez, and Katie Morrison disappeared into the Cascade Mountains, Girl Scout troops across the Pacific Northwest gathered to introduce a new badge that would ensure their story lived on to protect future generations. Margaret Chen held the prototype badge in her weathered hands, examining the design that incorporated symbols representing each of the 3 girls. A compass for Amy's leadership skills, a pine tree for Linda's love of nature, and a bright star for Katie's optimistic spirit. The words "Courage Badge" were embroidered beneath the symbols in the same green thread used for all official Girl Scout insignia. This badge isn't just about remembering Amy, Linda, and Katie, explained Regional Director Susan Walsh as she addressed the gathered scouts and families at Camp Cascade, built on land donated near the original Bear Creek site. It's about learning from their experience to keep other children safe in the wilderness. The Courage Badge requirements were comprehensive, developed by wilderness safety experts working with the families who had lived through 40 years of searching for answers. Scouts had to demonstrate proficiency with GPS devices, satellite communication equipment, and emergency shelter construction. They learned to file detailed hiking plans and understood the importance of never deviating from approved routes without proper authorization. 12-year-old Emma Thompson, granddaughter of the hiker who had discovered the final campsite, was among the first group of scouts to earn the new badge. "We practiced building emergency shelters like Mrs. Donnelly made for the girls," Emma explained to her grandmother. "But we also learned that the most important survival skill is staying where rescue teams can find you." The badge program included studying excerpts from Mrs. Donnelly's journal, helping scouts understand how small decisions in wilderness settings could have life-changing consequences. The curriculum emphasized group decision-making and the importance of questioning authority when safety was at risk. Tommy Chen, now serving as a volunteer wilderness safety instructor, taught the navigation portions of the badge program. Amy would have questioned Mrs. Donnelly's decision to leave the marked trail, he told each group of scouts. The journal shows that she tried to, but she was only 12 years old and had been taught to respect adult authority. "We want you to speak up if something doesn't feel safe." The first Courage Badge ceremony took place at the memorial site where Amy, Linda, and Katie were finally laid to rest. 150 scouts from troops throughout Oregon and Washington participated, creating the largest badge presentation in regional Girl Scout history. Maria Rodriguez attended the ceremony with her granddaughter Sophia, who had earned the badge despite Elena's lingering anxiety about outdoor activities. Linda would be so proud to see how her story is helping other children stay safe, Maria told the assembled families. As the scouts pinned their new badges to their sashes, Margaret Chen felt a sense of completion that had eluded her for over 4 decades. Amy's determination to earn the Advanced Outdoors badge had led to tragedy, but now her memory would help countless other young adventurers return home safely to their families. The girl's legacy was finally complete.